July of 1926. During this particular summer, the good people of Maryville, Tennessee were utterly terrified to go to sleep. As the deep darkness of night settled over East Tennessee, a rigid ritual began in homes across the county. Families checked their door locks one final time. Windows were tightly secured against the hot night air. And in bedrooms everywhere, loaded shotguns were placed beside beds. Because everyone knew that somewhere out there, hidden in the pitch black, someone was watching. He struck his victims under the absolute cover of night, and before the first rays of sunshine could touch the mountain ridges, he vanished into thin air. The local newspapers eventually gave this terrifying specter a name that sent shivers down the spine: the Night Marauder. Nearly 100 years later, that very same mystery remains completely unresolved. Tonight, we are digging up one of the most chilling, and until recently, forgotten true crime stories in East Tennessee history. And it's one that, for me, hits surprisingly close to home. Welcome back to Haunted Hollers and Eerie Encounters. I'm your host, Stormy Skies. The stories we explore on this show usually take us deep into the misty ridges and isolated valleys of the Smoky Mountains. Sometimes we delve into ancient legends. Sometimes we untangle age-old folklore passed down through the generations. But every now and then, we uncover real, documented historical events that are so deeply unsettling, they sound like a campfire ghost story. Tonight's story falls into that terrifying reality. Maryville, Tennessee is my hometown. Like many people who grow up in a place, I thought I knew its history pretty well, but until recently, I had never once heard of the Night Marauder. I had never heard of the suffocating wave of fear that completely gripped these communities during the late 1920s, or of the families who locked their doors every single night, endlessly wondering if they might be the next target. It wasn't until I was checking an email from my alma mater, Maryville College, that I discovered that a history professor is about to release a book detailing this fascinating and horrible true crime story. And what she and her research team of students have unearthed is easily one of the most disturbing, hidden chapters of East Tennessee history. When you walk through the area today, it is incredibly difficult to imagine the terror that once lived here. Modern Maryville is widely known for its small-town charm, stunning mountain views, and its warm, close-knit community. But back in the early 20th century, this entire region was a drastically quieter place. Many families lived in deeply isolated rural homes, scattered far apart across the hills. The connected roads were rough and unpaved. Electricity was a luxury that hadn't reached every household. And once darkness fell over the ridges, the night truly belonged to the unknown. That very isolation, which once brought peace, would soon become a weapon of absolute terror. Because beginning around the year 1919, reports of strange, violent nighttime attacks began appearing throughout East Tennessee. At first, investigators treated them as completely isolated, unrelated incidents. But over time, a terrifying pattern began to emerge, and the pattern frightened the community to their core. To truly understand the horror, I want you to close your eyes and imagine it's 1924. There are no televisions to distract you, no internet keeping you connected, no cell phones to call for instant help. Most homes in the rural stretches of East Tennessee still don't have electricity. When darkness falls here, it is a heavy, absolute, ink-black darkness. The only light you have to push back the shadows comes from the flicker of kerosene lamps, the cold glow of the moonlight, flashlights, or whatever faint light escapes from a distant neighbor's window across the valley. Now imagine sitting in that dim lantern light, hearing the rumors that a shadow is moving through the countryside at night, a faceless monster breaking into homes, violently attacking families while they sleep soundly in their beds. And the absolute worst part, nobody can seem to stop him. In the beginning, the crimes felt disconnected, A sudden shooting in one area, a brutal assault in another. But as the years passed, survivors began sharing chilling details that revealed undeniable similarities. The attacker almost exclusively chose homes that lacked electricity. Even more terrifyingly, survivors noticed that boxes of matches would mysteriously disappear from the house right before an attack took place. It was a calculated, sadistic tactic. The intruder was deliberately ensuring his victims would remain completely trapped in the blinding dark. And then came the stories. They were passed anxiously from neighbor to neighbor. They were whispered about after church. They were nervously discussed around the wood stoves at general stores. They were the kind of stories that made you compulsively glance towards your dark windows the second the sun went down. Because in Blount County, absolutely nobody knew where the night marauder would strike next. As the attacks multiplied, a suffocating anxiety settled over every community across East Tennessee. The predator wasn't confining himself to just one small town. Terrifying reports were exploding across Knoxville, Alcoa, Maryville, and the surrounding communities. Every single new attack brought a fresh wave of sensational newspaper headlines. Every headline brought wild, terrifying rumors, and every rumor brought more paralyzing fear. People found themselves constantly scanning the pitch-black tree lines outside their windows, listening intently for any unusual rustle in the brush. They wondered if the faceless stranger everyone was talking about might be standing just inches beyond the reach of their porch light, waiting for their lamps to go out. Imagine trying to close your eyes and get a peaceful night's rest under those circumstances. Imagine lying awake, hearing a floorboard creak on the porch, a heavy footstep outside in the gravel, a neighbor's dog barking frantically in the distance. As you lie there in the dark, paralyzed with fear, wondering, is tonight the night he comes to my door? Of all the tragic encounters linked to the night marauder case, one specific story stood out above the rest. It is the harrowing account of Luther and Ada Wells. Nearly a century later, Maryville College history professor Nancy Locklin-Sofer spoke about visiting Luther Wells's final resting place and leaving a stone on his grave as a simple gesture of respect, a quiet promise from the present to the past that his life and his tragedy have not been lost to time, because on one fateful night, absolute terror arrived at the Wells' home. Mirroring his previous attacks, the intruder slipped into the house, armed with a heavy pistol and a flashlight. When the stranger entered his home, Luther didn't hesitate. He immediately stood up to protect his family and confronted the intruder. What happened next shattered the night and the lives of the family in a matter of mere seconds. Blinding gunfire erupted in the dark room. Luther Wells was shot and mortally wounded, and his wife Ada was also shot and severely wounded during the chaotic gunfire. But unlike so many of the night marauder's previous victims, Ada Wells survived, and her survival changed the entire trajectory of the case. For the first time in years, investigators finally believed they had an eyewitness who might actually be able to look the monster in the eye and identify the attacker. But think about the unimaginable emotional burden Ada carried from that night forward. She wasn't just a clinical witness for the state. She was a grieving widow. She was a traumatized survivor. She was a woman forced to publicly relive the single worst night of her life, over and over again on the witness stand. Yet, showing incredible fortitude, she continued. She testified repeatedly as the complex legal proceedings stretched on and on. While the newspapers of the 1920s focused entirely on the sensational mystery of the attacker, it is so important for us to remember the real human beings whose lives were permanently shattered. The night marauder may be remembered today because of the mystery, but families like the Wells family deserve to be remembered because of their immense courage. As the intense wave of panic continued to lock East Tennessee in its grip, an even more sinister theatrical development emerged from the shadows. A letter was sent directly to the local sheriff. Inside, The anonymous writer explicitly claimed direct responsibility for the gruesome murders associated with the night marauder. To this day, historians don't know if the letter genuinely came from the hands of the killer, or if it was penned by a cruel hoaxer seeking cheap attention. But its psychological impact on the public was immediate and devastating. For communities already pushed to the brink of hysteria, the letter suggested something far more evil. That the person responsible might be hiding in plain sight, that he was actively watching the community panic, reading every single newspaper headline, and gleefully enjoying the terror he had created. The letter became one more terrifying reason for families to dread the coming night. Eventually, after years of dead ends, investigators found their spotlight on a local man named William Daniel Sheffey. For exhausted residents, it finally felt like the multi-year nightmare might be coming to an end. The news of Sheffey's arrest generated an absolute frenzy of public interest across the state. People demanded answers. They demanded swift justice. And more than anything, they desperately wanted to feel safe sleeping in their own homes again. Courtrooms were packed to maximum capacity. Newspapers tracked every minor development. And local citizens fiercely debated his guilt, his innocence, and whether authorities had finally found the real night marauder. Yet the legal reality proved far more complicated and tangled than anyone expected. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on witness identification, most notably from the brave Ada Wells. However, the defense fiercely challenged key elements of the testimony she had given concerning the identity of the attacker, questioning how anyone could clearly see a stranger in a pitch-black room during a frantic shootout. The legal warfare dragged on for years. One sensational trial collapsed into another, and then another. Yet despite years of intense investigation and relentless courtroom battles, a conviction never came. Ultimately, the state's charges were dismissed entirely, leaving one of East Tennessee's most horrifying mysteries completely unresolved. Was William Daniel Sheffey truly the monster who stalked the hills? Or had desperate authorities spent years pinning the blame on the wrong man? Nearly a century later, nobody can say with absolute certainty. Like so many true mysteries of the past, the terrifying saga of the night marauder gradually began to fade from community memory with the passing years. The original witnesses grew old and passed away. New generations grew up and took over the homesteads. Memories of the 1920s terror dimmed. Eventually, the night marauder became little more than a forgotten newspaper headline, preserved in archives and remembered by only a tiny handful of local historians and family descendants. For decades, it seemed likely that the victims themselves would be completely swallowed by time. But nearly a century later, Maryville College professor Nancy Locklin-Sofer and a dedicated team of students launched an intensive effort to reopen the cold case files. Digging deep into local newspaper archives, dusty court records, and forgotten historical documents, they began painstakingly reconstructing the timeline piece by piece. Their goal wasn't to play detective or unmask a century-dead killer. It was to reclaim the stolen narratives of the victims, the survivors, and the families whose real lives had been totally overshadowed by the sensationalism of the mystery itself. And as someone who grew up walking those exact same Maryville streets and later attended Maryville College myself, there's something deeply profound about watching a forgotten, haunting chapter of local history be brought back into the light. Because while the killer's identity remains lost to the shadows, the victims were real, the tolls the families paid was steep, and the grief was agonizingly felt throughout the community. And the lives of those devastated deserve to be remembered. The sweeping mountains of Appalachia guard countless secrets. Some fade into harmless legends, others evolve into classic ghost stories told around campfires. But some are true historical mysteries that simply refuse to stay buried. We may never know conclusively who exactly terrorized East Tennessee during those long, dark nights between 1919 and 1926. But what we do know is this: the surrounding communities were forever changed by these events, and sometimes true history can be infinitely more unsettling than any ghost story we could ever invent. The ridges of Appalachia have always been a place of mystery. Long before modern roads and bustling towns carved through the landscape, these ancient mountains witnessed both triumphs and tragedies alike. While some tales turn to myth, others are left to fade into forgotten newspaper pages or on weathered, moss-covered grave markers. For nearly a century, the story of the night marauder faded into the shadows. But thanks to the relentless work of a local historian, students and families determined to remember, those long silent voices are finally being heard once again. And while we may never know with certainty who stalked these communities under the cover of darkness, the people who lived through those terrifying nights deserve their place in our memory. This has been Haunted Hollers and Eerie Encounters. Thank you for listening and for stepping with me into the shadows of Appalachia. Before you go, I have a question for you. Do you know of a local legend, a tale of a nearby haunted house, or maybe something you yourself still can't explain? Give me a holler. Send your story to MyHollerStory@gmail.com, and your encounter might be featured on a future episode of Eerie Encounters, First-Hand Frights. And remember, your story doesn't have to come from the Great Smoky Mountains. If you've experienced something strange, unexplained, paranormal, or just plain unsettling, I'd love to hear your story. And if you're enjoying the show, make sure you're following so you don't miss which haunted holler we visit next. New episodes drop every weekend on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the incredible historical work done on this case and read the full deep dive account of this mystery, you can pre-order Professor Locklin-Sofer's upcoming book now. I've put the pre-order link directly in the show notes, so make sure to secure your copy. As always, I'll have all of our episode sources and further reading linked in the show notes, if you're brave enough to delve deeper into the shadows. And if you'd like to support the show, you can find my website in the description. Your follows, likes, and shares help more than you know. Until next time, remember to lock your windows, lock your doors, and stay out of the hollers after dark.